From Isaiah chapter 45. For the sake of my servant Jacob, Israel, my chosen one, I call you by name. I hail you by title, though you have not known me. I engird you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei ra, ani Adonai oseh cho'eleh. I form light, says God, and create darkness. I make well-being and create woe. I, the Lord, do all of these things. These words of the prophet date from the Persian restoration of Jerusalem under Cyrus. In many ways, these verses are a great review of our last 3 weeks of study together. In week 1, we said that God is mighty and in most aspects unnotable. Twice, the prophet says, you have not known me. But God is also the creator of the world and the universe. And we just read, Yotzer or vorei choshech. God forms light and darkness. That is the beginning of creation. And God also chose Israel as a special people with a special covenant. Israel, my chosen one, I call you by name. After 70 years of exile, God is eager to return Israel to her glory. If you were paying good attention, though, I quoted the last verse in Hebrew. God is the creator of master of all, light and darkness, peace, well-being, and yes, oseh ra. God creates and brings about calamity. In our prayers, we change ra to yotzer et hakol, but still the same idea. So this final topic of ours next week, we're going to wrap things up with a discussion, is the theology of suffering, often called Theodicy, explaining God, describing God. Why does suffering, especially of the innocent and the righteous, exist in our world? Of course, such an easy question. And what's going to make it difficult, again, is that we have to suspend logic and human rationality. We are not going to get exact answers, and we're going to have to be content with approximate answers and know that we're going to rely on different answers, perhaps at even different times in the experience in our life. And that is okay. The multiple answers. The way that I like to think about it is like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The minute you observe something, you have altered the reality. No true account of reality is possible. So what are some of Judaism's answers, approximations for why there is suffering in our world? The first answer is that true monotheism requires an acceptance that suffering is part of God's created universe. We just read from Isaiah, God creates Ra. And why is that the fact? Because when the Jews were in Babylonia, they were exposed to dualism, to Zoroastrianism, which talks about how there's two divine beings. There is the divine being of good and the divine being of bad. The being of light, the being of darkness, and the earth and the world is about the struggle between those two beings. Monotheism cannot tolerate that. God has to be the creator of all, even suffering. So then ask why? Why did God make suffering part of the universe's program? One answer is that suffering is God's currency of punishment for us. God truly cares about our behavior in that mode and is intimately involved in rewarding and punishing our behavior. Sounds great, but what about the suffering and the innocent and the righteous? Enter the concept of the world to come, the olam haba. There is a world after this earthly one, they say, that allows for a better accounting of our behavior and injustice. They say no one is perfect and no one is totally wicked. The punishments and rewards are allocated between this world and the next world, according to a divine will and wisdom that we cannot comprehend. But the idea is that the greater of suffering in this world, the more likely the next world will be full of reward and paradise. It's tempting for the rational in me to reject this understanding. There are just too many exemptions. How can we have the idea of an olam haba, the next world is going to be paradise, when an innocent person suffers not just a little bit, but greatly for years? Is it really going to sort of say, oh, they're going to have paradise in the world to come? Does that really bring me comfort? It's a challenge. But like I said, these answers are approximations. But sometimes this idea of a world to come actually is helpful. It's helpful when we think about the memories of our loved ones who have passed on physically, but we remember them so dearly as if they're still alive. And we want to experience their laughter, their jokes, their personality. And so we say that they're all gathered together at the pearly gates, whatever you want to describe it, having jokes together, enjoying a cup of tea. That is allowed because I can't disprove it. And so it's okay to have those answers. So to have this idea of olam haba is one to put in our toolkit. But certainly there are times that it's questioned. Again, when we see the great suffering of the innocent. So how do we explain that kind of suffering? Some people say it's called the righteous suffering. Isurim shel ahava, suffering of love. God is trying to teach us a lesson somehow, or just we have to accept it and find some meaning. According to this view, suffering is part of the fabric of the universe, the divine plan. And they say, think about it. If this was truly a hedonistic life, where all of our pleasures were here and everything was perfect, would we really be able to express gratitude to God, to what we have in this world, to be able to have the fortitude to continue on if everything is with us on a silver platter? So the answer is suffering is there as part of life to make meaning. And finally, the Bible has a genre called wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes is part of it. The book of Job, which really gets to the heart of the matter, is part of it. And the answer is really, there is no answer to suffering. The question of suffering, according to wisdom literature, is really beyond our comprehension. And we will never have a satisfactory answer because we cannot know God's ways. The book of Ecclesiastes reads, "Consider God's doing. Who can straighten what God has twisted? So in a time of good fortune, enjoy the good fortune. In a time of misfortune, reflect. The one no less than the others was God's doing. Consequently, human being can find no fault with God." The narrator continues, "In my own brief span of life, I have seen both these things. Sometimes a good man perishes in spite of his goodness, and sometimes a wicked one endures in spite of his wickedness." All of that is God's doing, and if there's misfortune, we just have to reflect and incorporate it into our life. The Shoah and the destruction that it wrought forces us really to also tackle the problem of evil not just calamity that God caused, but why is there evil people in the world? And with this, I conclude with the words of Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, the Pazitsna Rebbe. He might be known as the Eish Kodesh. He was a Hasidic Rebbe who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he wrote a commentary of all of the 52 Parshiot. He continued a shul going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, but he knew what his ultimate physical end was. And there were historians and scholars in the ghetto who collected papers and proof of what happened in the ghetto, and they buried it in milk jugs. And after the war, those milk jugs were discovered, and Rabbi Shapira's words were in there. So even though he perished, his words lived on, and he really gave us words from the depth of the suffering, and he's telling us how to cope. And so here's a quote that I wanted to share. There are times when you attribute to your heart saying, "This is just the organ of my mind within me. I can overcome my distress despite my sufferings and the sufferings of those around me, which are great." And yet one may return to oneself saying, "I'm broken, and how my weeping increases. My whole life is depressed and dark." Such a person is often embarrassed by themselves, he writes. Rabbi Shapira knows that people will rationalize their depression away. They'll say it's just mind over matter because they're embarrassed by their depression. But yet he knows that it is actually a condition that is not so easily to overcome. You can't rationalize away. You're going to be in sorrow sometimes. But Rabbi Shapira says, where is God to be found? God is actually found in the sorrow when you allow God to weep with you. He writes, the Holy Blessed One is to be found in the places of heartbreak and weeping, and they should weep along with the Holy Blessed One. The tears that one weeps with the Holy Blessed One strengthen such a person. By weeping, they are strengthened, then broken, and then energized once again. From the words of someone suffering in the middle of the Holocaust. Not saying, where is God? Or actually saying, where is God? What's the answer? God has been right here all the time. God is weeping along with us. It's not God sort of throwing suffering. God is suffering along with us and trying to help us cope with our depression and with our tears. Suffering is indeed in part of this world. There is no sense fighting it. Yes, we need to work to reduce human-caused evil and always speak up when we see stigmatization and stereotyping and all the things that we have learned post-Holocaust. But some of that is just going to be a fool's task anyway. There's always going to be suffering. God isn't a puppet master holding the marionette strings. Yes, God is omnipresent, though. And if we reach out to God, then hopefully God's love will support us in our suffering. We say every day, Adonai Hoshia HaMelech, Ya'anenu biyom korenu. God save us and answer us when we call. When we feel suffering, reach out to one another, reach out to God, and God will be there to offer us some comfort. Amen.